To learn useEffect today, we are going to be using a basic grocery list app. For our grocery list application, we have some simple functionality. We have the ability to add an item to our grocery list, and once we add that item, we can then change what that item is, and then we can either delete the item or check it off as complete. That's it. That's the application. It's very simple, and we just have a few functions here. We have add task, toggle complete, and delete task. So where does useEffect come into this? To start using useEffect, we first have to import it into our application. Once we've imported it into the React application, we can then start using it within our app. Generally, there are 3 different types of useEffect. The most basic useEffect is written as so. We have the useEffect function, which we're calling, and that useEffect is then passing in an arrow function. This function is what is going to run whenever the useEffect is called. And in this case, with this format, this useEffect is going to be called every single time something changes in the application. Let's add a simple console log just to see that. After adding our console log, we can then open up the console in our application, and you'll see that every time we do something within the application, for example, typing some text, deleting an item, adding an item, you can see that each time something is logged to the console. But this is just one form of the useEffect. There's also 2 more. In this format, you can see that we've added an extra bit into the useEffect, and that's this array here. This is an array of dependencies. For example, if we had our shopping list here, and we put it within this dependency, anytime this shopping list changes, whatever is within the function is going to run. If something is added to the shopping list, it's going to run. If something's deleted, if something changes, it's also going to run. If you added something else into this array, it would listen for both of them, and if either of them changes, then it's going to call the useEffect function. Let's add another console log just to see how this works. Then we'll also comment out the previous useEffect just so both aren't running at the same time. We'll refresh our page just to clear our console, and you'll see that again, anytime something changes, that log is going to go into the console. Now for this demo, these 2 seem like they're basically doing the same thing. But if we were to have multiple different states updating, say we had 10 different state variables here, anytime any of them update, which causes the component to re-render, this one would run. For this useEffect, only when the shopping list is updated would this useEffect run. So that's these 2 explained. There's also a third one. Now you might be thinking to yourself, this is the exact same as the previous one. And it is, but the difference here is that we're actually not going to put something within the dependencies. If you don't have anything within the array of dependencies, then this useEffect will run only when the component is first rendered. So just that initial time it's going to be called. If we add another console log, and again we'll comment out this first one, when we refresh the page, clear the console, you'll see that this one here is only run with the first time that the component is rendered. If we make any changes, if we delete an item, if we write something in there, it's not going to be called again, only the first time. And also, if you're not aware, when a React component is rendered for the first time in strict mode, it's actually rendered twice, which is why we can actually see 2 console logs. But this doesn't really mean anything, this is just how React works in strict mode, so assume that this first one doesn't exist. It's only been called once. The first time that it's called, this is just a test. And that's it, from a high level. There is other things to consider when using useEffect. For example, if within this useEffect we're listening for the shopping list to change, if within the useEffect itself we set the shopping list to equal something else, then we would create a continuous loop. If I was to set this to an empty array, you'll see that our console log is going a bit crazy right now. It's calling what's in that useEffect over and over again. And this is because essentially what we're doing here is we're listening for a change to the shopping list. As a result, we're calling this function, which is then changing the shopping list, which is then being listened to here to call the function again, which is then changing the shopping list, and so on and so forth. We've created an infinite loop. This is a big problem in applications. If you do this, you will break whatever you're trying to build. So this is a really important point to watch out for. Make sure that within your useEffect, if you're listening to a state change, you're not then changing that state within the useEffect. Then you'll avoid all of this infinite looping. We'll remove that now so our console can settle down, and we'll refresh the page just to get things back to normal. Let's now make these useEffects do something practical. As you can see, within our grocery list application, when we add items and we add something to our list, maybe we add another item, we're not sure what this one will be, we aren't saving this grocery list anywhere. If I refresh the page, it all goes away. Now we can improve this application by using these useEffects, and we'll interact with an external system, which in this case would be local storage, but you could interact with a normal database in a real application. So let's write those useEffects. Now I know I've made a lot of changes here, but I'm going to go through each of them one by one just to explain what has happened. So for this application, our useEffect, which is listening for changes every single time, we don't really have a useful use case for that, but in some cases this can be useful. Say for example if you're listening for the window resize. For our application though, we're interacting with the local storage and we're setting an item shopping list, and we're setting this every time the shopping list updates. So when we call our add task or toggle complete or delete task, or we change whatever's inside one of those list items, then this function is going to be called, and that's going to update the local storage with our updated list. We've also added a couple more state variables. So we have this changes made and we have is loading. Now the reason for the changes made here is to introduce you to something known as the return statement within a useEffect. We'll touch on this a little bit later. For now, we'll remove it. So if we refresh our page, we can see that this function here, if the page is no longer loading, then we're going to go into the local storage and we're going to set our item, which is shopping list, by stringifying the shopping list state variable, which has just been updated and was listened here within the dependency array. Along with that, we're going to update our changes made variable. And we have this just to track how many changes we've actually made within our grocery list. If you see in the console, if I add an item, then the number of changes made has increased by 1. If I write something in here, every time I type a letter, it's going to update. So that's going to be another change made. If I check it off, another one. And if I delete, another change has been made. So what was the purpose of that return statement? If I add that back, you'll see that I'm setting the changes made here to 0. The return statement within a useEffect will always run before the other code which is within it. So what does that mean? When the shopping list changes, we're then going to enter our useEffect. The useEffect will then look to see if we have a return. If we have a return, it's then going to first run this. So in our case, we're going to set the changes made to 0. Of course, in a real application, this has no practical purpose, but just to show how it works, we're just going to show that first we're setting the changes made to 0, and then we're running the rest of the code. And you'll see that now it's acting a bit differently. When I refresh the page and I make an update, the number of changes made is always 1. If I type a sentence here, let's say hello, you can see the number of changes is still 1. And this is because every time the useEffect is being called, we're first setting the changes made to 0, and then we're running the rest of the code, which is then incrementing that changes made by 1. And that's all there really is to it. The useEffect can be broken down into 3 different types. We have the useEffect, which runs anytime anything changes within the component. We then have the useEffect, which is only being called the first time that a component is rendered. And finally, we have the useEffect, which is utilizing that dependency array. Whenever this state variable changes, then the code is going to run. And within any of these useEffects, with whether it be the one with the dependency, the one that runs the first time, or the one that runs every single time, we can add a return. And whatever is within that return will run before the rest of the code. And this is really great if you're trying to clean things up. Let's say, for example, this useEffect added an event listener. If this useEffect was called 100 times, then we would have 100 different event listeners which are running within our application. This could slow things down or just make things a bit complicated. So what we could do is within this return, we could clear our event listeners. Then we would add that event listener again. This means that if this useEffect was called 100 different times, then we would first remove whatever's there and then add it. So we would just have 1 because every time there was 1, it would be cleared and then we would add it again. So now you know how useEffect works. And remember, if you're not trying to synchronize a component with an external system, you probably don't need to use a useEffect, and you probably shouldn't, because these can be quite difficult to work with when you have a large application. So it's best to avoid them unless you're trying to synchronize a component with an external system. Then it's a great idea. That's what the intended purpose is. I hope this video has been useful to you and that you've learned something about how to use useEffect. If you already knew this, then I hope it was a good revision material. If you'd like to learn more about React, please check out these other videos, or you can go to my channel where you'll find other React videos. Thank you for watching.